Act 3, Breaking Past Apologetics. As I mentioned, apologetics is really heating up with two major camps. One who is arguing for ancient contexts for the Book of Mormon, and the other arguing for a 19th century context. Fortunately, scholars had been looking at different approaches altogether in the pages of dialogue all along, from reception history to literary studies to textual studies. But these battles were being fought here too, and sucked up a lot of attention. So I want to discuss a few classics that all students of Book of Mormon should know that were an early attempt to get past the hostility and find some common ground and shared solutions. First is Bruce Lindgren's Sign or Scripture, Approaches to the Book of Mormon from spring 1986. I love this one so much. It's by an RLDS scholar who says that maybe this whole debate about which context we need to read the Book of Mormon is wrong-headed. This is reading it as a history book. Quote, why does discussion of the Book of Mormon typically tend to focus on questions of historicity and authorship? On Mesoamerican archaeology, chiasmus, and word prints? This sees the Book of Mormon as a sign of Joseph Smith's prophetic call or his status as a fraud, but that's a pretty narrow way of reading it. Instead, Lindgren issues a challenge to focusing on historicity in Book of Mormon interpretation, and instead says that we should read it as scripture. Quote, I find a more personally relevant question to be, how does the Book of Mormon present the basic doctrines of the gospel? What role should the Book of Mormon play in our religious and intellectual lives? Is it a sign of the divine origin of the restoration? Or is it scripture? There has grown up a whole school of thought around this latter approach in Book of Mormon theology now, especially from Jim Faulkner, who says that history is the wrong genre for understanding scripture. But we see here this early treatment in 1986. The next article is from spring 1987, Book of Mormon as Modern Expansion of an Ancient Source. Here, Blake Ostler weighs in on the historicity question and attempts to cut the Gordian knot with a hybrid solution. He uses source criticism, a method that attempts to separate out distinct underlying sources in a single document. This is one of the classical methods in biblical studies, here applied in a distinctive way to the Book of Mormon. Ostler argued that the plates were real, that the Nephites were real, but that Joseph Smith drew on his own experience in the narrative. In this way, he could grant the best of the ancient parallels and the best of the 19th century parallels to argue that there was a base text as an ancient source, but also that it catalyzed new revelation for the modern day through Joseph Smith as translator. That is, a modern expansion of an ancient source. Ostler conceded that there were a number of anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, especially related to theological ideas, but he also found value in ancient parallels to rituals, ancient prophetic practices, and more. This approach was obviously hated by many who were invested on either side of this, but it has grown in popularity with a number of contemporary believing scholars who subscribe to the basic premise. The details of analysis have continued to be debated, disputing the validity of the various parallels that he discusses, but Ostler's solution remains a useful survey for some of the major arguments from his time. Sometimes in this period, we saw more close exegetical readings of specific passages, especially those that loomed large in popular LDS culture. Ezekiel 37, which discusses the sticks of Judah and the sticks of Joseph, was one such case. In 1990, Brian Keck wrote, Ezekiel 37, Sticks and Babylonian Writing Boards, a Critical Appraisal, where he explained what those passages meant in their ancient context. We weren't done with the B.H. Roberts story either. Brigham Madsen, a professor at Utah State, wrote in 1993, B.H. Roberts' studies of the Book of Mormon, Was Roberts a believer or a skeptic? Madsen offers more insights into how B.H. Roberts dealt with his questions about Book of Mormon historicity, and he offers new historical details to the drama around his story. So there were articles that were challenging traditional history or interpretations of the Book of Mormon in these years, but I think that in the late 1980s, this is a really important period. This brief moment showed sincere and serious efforts to bridge the growing gap between scholarly camps. But it was an unsuccessful and short-lived one. An attempt to find a middle way for believers that could also accommodate the arguments from critics seemed to satisfy no one, least of all the apologists. The war was raging on.
Beyond the Block, part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, is a weekly Come Follow Me podcast that centers the marginalized in Mormonism. Join Brother Jones and Brother Knox, a Black lifelong member and a queer convert theologian respectively, as they read the scriptures through the lenses of their identities and others in an effort to bring the culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints closer and more in line with its theology, which centers Christ's justice and compassion. New episodes every Monday.
Dialogue Podcast Network.